A millionaire CEO is challenged by a food delivery worker and falls head over heels in love. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Sarah Evans peddled as if her life depended on it. And in a way, it did. Her shift at the delivery company was almost over, but this last order was taking longer than expected. Come on, she muttered, swerving around a distracted pedestrian who was walking at a snail's pace while typing on his phone. Finally, she reached Smith & Associates, a law firm so fancy that even the receptionist looked like she had stepped out of a French perfume commercial. As soon as the elevator doors opened, a group of lawyers rushed in, deep in conversation about an important meeting. Probably something about million-dollar contracts, not about how to make ends meet at the end of the month, like her. Sarah hurried in right behind them, slipping through the closing doors like a delivery ninja. Perfect, she whispered to herself. But then, another man stepped in. He had a serious air, a flawless suit, and perfectly styled hair. And at that exact moment, the elevator let out a loud, shrill beep. Beep, beep. One of the lawyers checked the digital panel and widened his eyes. We've hit the weight limit. The group exchanged glances. One of them turned directly to Sarah. Someone needs to step out. Sarah blinked. Okay, who was the last one to get in? She looked straight at the impeccably dressed man. It was him. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised at being called out so bluntly. Me? Yes, if someone has to get out, it should be the last person who got in. Basic line etiquette. Good point, a lawyer murmured beside him. But before the man in the suit could step out, he crossed his arms. I'm not leaving. I need to get upstairs. Sarah crossed her arms too. Great. So do I. And my delivery is just as important as your meeting, so... The lawyers exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to do. Miss, please, just take the next one. It's only a few minutes. A few minutes could cost me my delivery. You're serious? Yes. Why should I be the one to leave and not him? She pointed at the man in the suit again, who now had a slight smirk, as if he was actually enjoying this. Because he's Nicholas Smith, the CEO of this firm. Sarah blinked. So what? CEOs can wait too, right? Silence. Then Nicholas smiled, looking straight at her. You've got guts. I've got a delivery to make. And I have a company to run. The lawyers sighed in frustration. Finally, one of them stepped out. There. Now stop arguing. The doors closed and the elevator started moving. Sarah glanced at Nicholas. I bet you got your CEO title by arguing with people until they gave up. And I bet you'd make a great lawyer. Sarah scoffed. Why does everyone keep saying that? On the 28th floor, the lawyers exited first, ignoring Sarah completely. Nicholas headed straight for his office, while Sarah went to drop off the order. When she checked the recipient's name, she froze. No! She took a deep breath, hoping it was just a system error. But it wasn't. She knocked on the door, already preparing herself for the awkward conversation ahead. Nicholas looked up, genuinely surprised to see her. You again? Sarah forced a smile so stiff it could be considered fraudulent. Yep. Life's little ironies. Here's your food, Mr. CEO, who can't wait for an elevator. She placed the bag on his desk with just a little more force than necessary. Nicholas held back a laugh. Looks like we were meant to cross paths more than once today. Or maybe I've been cursed by the god of bad luck. He picked up the bag and studied her for a moment. You're a great speaker. Have you ever thought about doing something other than food delivery? Sarah narrowed her eyes. Why does everyone keep saying that? Because you're quick-witted, sharp, and incredibly bold. That's rare. I studied law for a bit, but I had to drop out. Why? She looked away. Personal reasons. She crossed her arms. Look, if you're about to give me some motivational speech, I'll pass. Nicholas chuckled. Not at all. He grabbed a piece of paper, scribbled something, and slid it across the desk. This is a mock case. An employee was fired without cause. How can they fight it? Sarah picked up the paper and read it. Seriously? You're testing me now? I'm curious. Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't resist the challenge. It depends on the contract and the length of service. If the termination was without prior notice, he may be entitled to compensation according to labor laws. If there's a specific clause in the contract, he could claim a breach of agreement. Nicholas watched her with a glint in his eyes. You have talent. Sarah frowned. Was that a test? It was, and you passed. She huffed. Great. Can I go now? Nicholas grabbed her insulated food bag before she could stand up. If you want a better job than delivering food, come to my office tomorrow. Let's talk. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you. Sarah took his card and left without a word. Nicholas watched her go, a curious smile on his lips. That girl wasn't ordinary, and he wanted to find out exactly what she was capable of. Sarah wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that she had been tested without warning, or the fact that somehow she had passed. After leaving the Smith & Associates building, she looked at Nicholas's card as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Only instead of millions, the prize was a mysterious job working alongside a demanding CEO. She sighed. If I keep going at this pace, I'll end up signing a contract without reading the fine print. When she got home, Mia, her roommate, was already on the couch, munching on popcorn and watching a reality show. So how was your battle with the lawyers? Sarah flopped into the armchair. I got fired, argued with the CEO, and now he's offering me a job. Mia's eyes widened. Wait, the guy from the elevator? The one and only. Mia blinked, then clicked her tongue. If this were a cliché romance, you two would be married by the end of the year. Sarah grabbed a pillow and threw it at her friend. This is real life, Mia. I just want to pay my bills. And what are you going to do? Sarah looked at Nicholas's card again and took a deep breath. I think I'll go. I've got nothing to lose. Sarah took a deep breath before stepping into the building. This time, no food bag, no delivery uniform, no smell of takeout. She was dressed as professionally as her budget allowed. A light blue blouse, black pants, and a pair of shoes that would probably give her blisters if she walked too much. The receptionist recognized her immediately. You again? Sarah smiled. No crowded elevators this time. The woman chuckled and picked up the phone. Mr. Smith, your guest is here. After a brief pause, she nodded. You can go up. Sarah headed straight to Nicholas's office. This time, when the elevator doors opened, no one told her to leave. When she entered, Nicholas was sitting behind his desk, as if he had already known she would come. He smiled when he saw her. Welcome to the office, Sarah. I haven't accepted anything yet. Then why are you here? Sarah crossed her arms. Curiosity. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Great. Then have a seat. Sarah hesitated, but eventually sat in the chair across from him. Nicholas took a file and placed it on the desk. Here's your first challenge. Sarah picked up the document and quickly skimmed through it. Wait, this is a real contract? Yes. And you want me to? Review it and tell me if there's anything wrong. Sarah narrowed her eyes. This still feels like a test. Nicholas smiled. Of course it is, but that's how you'll learn. Sarah huffed but grabbed a pen and started reading. 3 minutes later, she was already marking up several clauses. Nicholas watched, amusement hidden in his expression. Find anything? Sarah looked up. If the contracting party fails to meet the deadline, the penalty fee will be determined at the contractor's discretion based on what is most convenient. She looked at Nicholas. That basically gives the contractor the right to charge whatever they want. Nicholas nodded. And is that legal? Sarah gave a small smirk. Legal? Yes. Ethical? Not at all. Nicholas let out a small chuckle. I like the way you think. Sarah crossed her arms. So did I pass the second test? Nicholas stood up and extended his hand. If you accept the job, this will be your daily routine. Sarah hesitated for a second, then she shook his hand. I accept, but no coffee. Nicholas smiled. We'll see. Sarah was introduced to the office as Nicholas's new assistant. The murmurs started immediately. Is that the girl from the elevator? Yeah, he actually hired her. But she was a delivery girl. Sarah rolled her eyes. Great, my nickname is already set. Lena, Nicholas's secretary, smiled. Don't worry, they'll forget in a few weeks. Or remember forever. Lena laughed. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be working. Sarah was led to a desk near Nicholas's. Here's your space. You can start by organizing these files. Sarah looked at the stack of papers. Is this a punishment? No. This is a normal day. Sarah sighed and started reading the documents. 15 minutes later, she had already found 2 serious mistakes. She picked up a pen and began marking the inconsistencies. Nicholas walked by and stopped when he saw her notes. You've already found errors? Sarah looked up. If I'm going to be fired for correcting bad contracts, just let me know now. Nicholas laughed. Relax. You're doing exactly what I expected. Sarah let out a breath of relief. Great, because I'm already halfway through the second contract. Nicholas watched, impressed. At this pace, you'll be giving me orders soon. Sarah smiled. Don't doubt it. She quickly realized that not everyone was happy with her presence there. Hader Reynolds, a more experienced attorney, had been watching her with suspicion since she arrived. At lunchtime, he finally decided to confront her. You know you don't deserve to be here, right? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Oh, and who decides that? You? I studied for years to be here. You were delivering food last week. Sarah smiled. And yet, Nicholas hired me. What does that say about you? Hader turned red. Let's see how long you last. Sarah tilted her head. If you want to bet, I'm in. At that moment, Nicholas appeared. If you're done with this ego contest, we have a client waiting. Sarah followed Nicholas, a victorious smile on her face. Hader stayed behind, clearly frustrated. But Sarah knew this was just the first of many battles in that office. She was still trying to wrap her head around the fact that just a week ago, she was delivering food, and now she was the personal assistant to the CEO of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. If someone had told her this would happen, she would have laughed in their face. But there she was, sitting at her new desk, reviewing contracts while receiving judgmental looks from some attorneys who were clearly unhappy with her presence. She didn't care. Well, actually, she did a little, but she would never show it. Nicholas walked past her desk with a folder in his hand. Have you finished the contracts I gave you? Sarah picked up the stack of papers and raised an eyebrow. If you want me to review them in the dark and with my eyes closed, I can pretend I have. He laughed. Take this folder. We have a meeting with an important client in 10 minutes. Sarah's eyes widened. Wait, I'm going to a meeting? Nicholas shrugged. If you want to learn, you need to see how things work in practice. She grabbed the folder, straightened her posture, and followed him down the hallway. It was funny how, even though she wasn't a lawyer, she felt like she belonged there more than some who were looking down on her. When they entered the meeting room, they found a middle-aged man in a dark suit sitting with a serious expression. He looked at Nicholas, then at Sarah, clearly surprised. Who is this? Nicholas sat down and gestured for Sarah to do the same. My assistant, Sarah Evans, the man frowned. Assistant? I was expecting someone more experienced. Sarah smiled and crossed her arms. Funny, I was expecting more polite clients. Nicholas suppressed a laugh while the man's eyes widened. What? She opened the folder and slid a contract toward him. Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Martinez. You want to renegotiate the termination clause in your company's contract, correct? The man narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. Yes. Sarah gave a patient smile. The problem is, if you do it the way you suggested, you'll be opening the door for others to use the same argument against you. You don't want that, do you? The man stared at the document, his frown deepening. Nicholas crossed his arms and looked at Sarah with amusement. And what's the solution, Sarah? She picked up a pen and circled a section of the contract. Adjust this part here, ensuring that any changes to the termination clause can only apply in specific, predefined situations. This prevents loopholes. Mr. Martinez looked at Nicholas. Has she always been like this? Nicholas smiled. Since day one. The man shook his head and let out a sigh. Well, I like someone who gets straight to the point. Let's move forward with this. Sarah kept a neutral expression, but inside, she wanted to celebrate. Her first meeting, and she had already solved a problem before it turned into a lawsuit. As they left the room, Nicholas looked at her approvingly. If you keep this up, you'll end up taking my job. She shrugged. Don't worry, I'll let you keep the vice-president spot. He laughed. Come with me. We have something else to take care of." Sarah followed him through the hallways to a large conference room where several lawyers were engaged in a heated discussion. "This won't work," one of them snapped. "If we don't find a solution, our client will lose millions," another shot back. Nicholas stepped in, and the room fell silent. "You all look lost." One of the lawyers, Hyder, who had already made it clear he didn't like Sarah being there, stood up with an irritated look. "We have a complex case, and we're stuck." Nicholas took a folder from one of the lawyers and tossed it onto the table. "Let's see if my new assistant has an idea." All eyes turned to Sarah, and she felt the weight of their expectations settle on her shoulders. She picked up the document and started reading quickly. The case involved a company trying to terminate a contract without paying the penalty fee, claiming there was a failure in the service provided. She looked up. "Is there concrete proof of the failure?" one of the lawyers responded. "The company says there is, but the documents they provided aren't strong enough to prove it." Sarah flipped through a few more pages, then smiled. "Here's your way out." Hyder crossed his arms. "Let's see what the delivery girl has to say." Sarah ignored his mocking tone. If the company wants to terminate the contract without paying the penalty, they need to prove there was a serious failure in the service. But in this case, since their documents aren't enough, we can argue that unilaterally canceling the contract without payment constitutes a breach of contract. Nicholas smiled. "Exactly." The lawyers exchanged glances, and even Hyder looked surprised. That could actually work. Nicholas looked at Sarah with a satisfied expression. "Well done, Evans. Looks like you're getting the hang of this." She crossed her arms and smirked. "I'm just getting started." Once everyone had left, Nicholas leaned against the table and studied her. "You know you're making some people uncomfortable here, right?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, you noticed? I thought they were loving my presence." He chuckled. "You're good, Sarah. Better than many here. But that also means some people will try to bring you down." She narrowed her eyes. "Are you trying to scare me?" "No. I'm preparing you," she sighed. "Don't worry, I've been through worse." Nicholas watched her for a moment before smiling. "Good, because I have a feeling things are about to get even more interesting around here." Sarah grinned. "Can't wait." She turned to leave, but Nicholas called her back. "Oh, one more thing." She stopped and looked at him. "What?" He tossed a folder to her. "Your next challenge, and this time, I want you to present the solution directly to the client." Sarah looked at the folder, then back at him. "You really enjoy testing me, don't you?" Nicholas smiled. "And you really enjoy surprising me." She held on to the folder and walked out of the room, feeling like this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she had imagined. Nicholas watched her go, a smile on his face. This is going to be fun. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she had just become a key player in that office. And some people wouldn't like it one bit. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to give up. She never did. Sarah left Nicholas's office, feeling the weight of the folder he had given her. It was a new challenge, and she knew this test wasn't just about her technical skills. It was also about how she would handle the growing tension in the office. Since she had started working there, she had noticed the suspicious glances and the whispers in the hallways. Some thought she was a joke. Others saw her as a threat. She didn't care, or at least she tried not to. She sat at her desk and opened the folder, carefully reading through the documents. The case was a contractual dispute between a company and a supplier claiming breach of contract. The company wanted to terminate the agreement without paying compensation, arguing that the supplier had missed deadlines. The problem? The contract wasn't as clear as it should have been, leaving loopholes that could favor either side. Sarah took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. She had to prepare her argument and present it directly to the client. That meant there was no room for mistakes. If she failed, she would be giving her critics exactly what they wanted, an excuse to say she didn't belong there. She spent the entire morning analyzing the contract, taking notes, and cross-referencing information with other documents attached to the case. It wasn't just about understanding the law. It was about understanding how the words on paper could be used in favor of the client. Before she knew it, It was already lunchtime. She got up and headed to the office cafeteria, where a few tables were occupied by lawyers engaged in lively conversations. As soon as she walked in, she noticed the looks. Some ignored her completely, while others whispered to their colleagues. She grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, trying to ignore the murmurs around her. But then Hyder's voice, clearly not a fan of hers, echoed through the room. "So, is the office's rising star already preparing for her big disaster?" Sarah took a deep breath before turning to face him. Hyder was sitting with two other lawyers who chuckled quietly. "If by big disaster you mean the inevitable success of my work, then yes, I am getting ready." His colleagues laughed, but Hyder kept his eyes fixed on her. "Let's see if Nicholas keeps protecting you after you make a major mistake." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and smiled. "Funny, Hyder, you seem very concerned about my career. Maybe you should focus on your own. Or are you afraid of being left behind?" The laughter at his table stopped. Hyder looked at her, clearly irritated, but said nothing. Sarah just smiled and walked away, feeling like she had won another small battle. Back at her desk, she spent the afternoon refining her argument. She knew she had found a strong approach to defend the client, but she needed to make sure everything was perfect. By the time she finished, it was nearly the end of the workday. She walked to Nicholas's office, knocked on the door, and stepped inside. He looked up from his computer and smiled. "So, are you ready?" Sarah placed the folder on his desk. "Yes, and I think the client will like what I've put together." Nicholas picked up the papers and started reading. As he went through them, his smile grew. "You pinpointed exactly where the weaknesses were. Strong argument." Sarah crossed her arms. "So when's the meeting?" Nicholas checked his watch. "Tomorrow morning. I hope you're prepared." She smirked. "I always am." The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office earlier than usual. She reviewed her materials one last time before heading to the conference room. Nicholas was already there, along with the client, Mr. Wallace, a middle-aged businessman with a sharp gaze. "Mr. Wallace, this is Sarah Evans, my assistant. She will be presenting the case analysis." Wallace looked at her, visibly surprised. "Her, are you sure?" Sarah held back a smile. She was used to this kind of reaction. "I'm sure, Mrs. Drack Wallace, and by the end of this meeting, you will be too." He seemed intrigued, but nodded. Sarah opened her folder and began her presentation. She calmly explained the contract's weak points, highlighted flaws in the supplier's arguments, and proposed a strategy that would put Mr. Wallace's company in a strong position without violating any clauses. When she finished, the client remained silent for a few moments, studying the papers in front of him. Finally, he smiled. "Impressive. You've got talent, young lady." Nicholas smiled. "Told you she was good." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, but inside she felt a wave of satisfaction. She knew she had done a great job. Mr. Wallace stood up and extended his hand. "I'm convinced. Let's go with this strategy." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Great choice." When the meeting ended, Nicholas waited until everyone had left before turning to Sarah with a satisfied smile. "You really enjoy surprising people, don't you?" She shrugged. "I just do my job." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Keep it up, Evans." Sarah walked out of the room feeling accomplished, but she knew this was only the beginning. If she really wanted to establish herself there, she would have to keep proving her worth every single day. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Let's play a little game with those who only read the comments. Type McDonald's in the comments. Only those who make it this far will understand. Now let's continue the story. Sarah left the meeting room feeling a mix of relief and excitement. The client had accepted her argument without hesitation, and Nicholas seemed pleased with her performance. But she knew that in the office, this didn't mean things would get any easier. On the contrary, Hyder and the others who resented her presence were probably even more annoyed. She walked back to her desk and dropped into her chair, letting out a long sigh. Lena, who was organizing some papers at the desk next to hers, glanced at her with an amused smile. "You've got that victorious look. What happened?" Sarah grinned. "Let's just say another client underestimated me and walked away impressed with my work." Lena chuckled. "That's going to become a habit." Sarah raised an eyebrow. I hope so. But I get the feeling that the more I get things right, the more some people around here get uncomfortable. Lena paused for a second and sighed. Well, you're not wrong. A lot of people think you shouldn't be here, but you know the good part? What? They only feel threatened because you're really good. Sarah chuckled. That's one way to look at it. But before she could continue the conversation, an email popped up on her screen. It was a meeting request for later that afternoon. The subject? Team performance evaluation. Sarah frowned. Is this normal? Lena glanced at the screen and sighed. Not exactly. Evaluations happen, but they're usually one-on-one with supervisors. A group meeting like this seems suspicious. Sarah immediately knew this wasn't just a routine evaluation. It was likely Heitor or another lawyer trying to put her on the spot. Nicholas appeared out of nowhere, as if he had sensed her concern. I saw you got called into the meeting. Sarah nodded. Any idea what they're up to? Nicholas crossed his arms. I have a pretty good guess. They're trying to make it look like hiring you was a mistake. Sarah took a deep breath. And do you think they'll succeed? Nicholas smiled. No, because they still don't know who they're dealing with. Sarah smirked. I like that confidence. Nicholas handed her a file. Before the meeting, I want you to go over this. It's a case that might interest you. She took the document and started reading. It was a wrongful termination lawsuit, a case where an employee had been dismissed without cause or prior notice. But the interesting part? The company's lawyer responsible for the violation was none other than Heitor Reynolds. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. Are you giving me ammunition? Nicholas raised an eyebrow. I'm just providing knowledge. What you do with it is up to you. Sarah knew exactly what she was going to do with it. The conference room was packed when Sarah walked in. Heitor was seated at the front, flanked by two senior attorneys, likely there as backup. Nicholas entered right behind her, taking a seat in the corner, quietly observing. Mr. Barnes, the senior lawyer, cleared his throat and looked around the room. We're here to discuss team performance and how we can improve internal processes at the firm. Sarah knew that was just an excuse to get to her. Heitor was the first to speak. I think we should talk about hiring assistants without proper credentials. Silence fell over the room. Sarah raised an eyebrow and looked straight at him. Are you talking about me, Heitor? He smirked. If the shoe fits, Sarah chuckled. Interesting, because I could say the same about lawyers who lose cases due to poor argumentation. Heitor frowned. What are you talking about? Sarah pulled out the document Nicholas had given her and slid it across the table. This case, your client lost because you failed to properly contest the contract termination. Heitor picked up the file, his face turning red. This has nothing to do with this meeting, Sarah smiled. Oh, but it does, because you're questioning my place here while you have a history of mistakes that cost our clients money. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Heitor, do you have anything to say about this case? Heitor swallowed hard. It was a small mistake. Sarah shrugged. Small? The client lost thousands of dollars. If it were me, I would have spotted the loophole in the contract before the deal was signed. Nicholas remained silent, but the amused glint in his eyes showed he was enjoying the moment. Mr. Barnes sighed. I think we can conclude that Miss Evans is making a valuable contribution to the firm. This meeting is adjourned. Sarah watched as Heitor's expression darkened, but he had no choice but to accept it. As everyone left the room, Nicholas approached her. You played that well, Sarah smiled. You gave me the cards, he shrugged, and you knew exactly when to use them. Sarah glanced at Heitor as he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I don't think he's going to give up that easily. Nicholas grinned. Even better for us. The more they try to take you down, the stronger you'll become. Sarah took a deep breath. And I do love a good challenge. She knew this battle was just beginning. But one thing was certain. She wasn't just some delivery girl. She was here to stay, and no one was going to stop her. Sarah felt that something was about to happen. Ever since she had dismantled Heitor's attempt to discredit her in the meeting, the stares at the office had become even more intense. By now, She was certain that some lawyers were just waiting for the slightest mistake to use as an excuse to take her down. But if they thought she was the type to back down under pressure, they were very mistaken. She had fought for everything she had in life, and this time would be no different. That morning, as soon as she entered the office, Lena approached her with a worried look. "I just heard something strange." Sarah raised an eyebrow as she grabbed a cup of coffee. "Strange how?" Lena glanced around and lowered her voice. "Heitor is up to something. He wants to use the next negotiation meeting with an important client to expose you." Sarah gave a small smirk. "Of course he does, but what's his plan?" "It looks like he's planning to put you on the spot during the meeting, hoping you'll make a mistake in front of the client." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, looking completely unfazed. "Then he's in for a surprise." Lena blinked. "You seem really calm." Sarah chuckled. "He wants me to fail? Well, I'm going to shine." Nicholas appeared at the door holding a folder. "Evans, we have a meeting in an hour. I want you to lead the contractual part." Sarah smiled. "Consider it done." Nicholas looked at her for a moment, and a smile appeared on his lips. "I knew I'd like having you here." An hour later, Sarah walked into the conference room where Nicholas was already seated beside the client, Mr. Callahan, the owner of a major tech company closing a contract with a key supplier. Across the table sat the supplier's lawyers, and of course Heitor, who looked far too pleased with himself. Sarah took a seat next to Nicholas and opened her folder. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Callahan looked at Nicholas, then at Sarah. "She's leading the negotiation?" Nicholas nodded. "Trust me, she's the best person for the job." Heitor smirked, clearly waiting for Sarah to make a mistake. "Let's see how the firm's new rising star does." Sarah ignored his tone and looked directly at the supplier's lawyers. "We've reviewed the contract and identified a few points that need to be adjusted before we proceed." She picked up one of the documents and circled a paragraph with her pen. "This clause here is ambiguous and could lead to unnecessary disputes. If we leave it as is, both parties might interpret it differently if something goes wrong in the future." The supplier's lawyers exchanged glances. "What do you suggest?" Sarah turned the page and pointed to the revised section. "We adjusted the wording to ensure that any changes to the contract's scope must be formally documented and signed by both parties. This prevents disputes and ensures greater transparency." Mr. Callahan reviewed the document and nodded. "That makes sense." Heitor leaned back in his chair. "But the supplier may want flexibility to make changes without having to formalize every detail." Sarah remained composed. "That wouldn't be in our client's best interest. Too much flexibility could create loopholes for changes that weren't previously agreed upon." Nicholas crossed his arms, satisfied. "Exactly." The supplier's lawyers murmured among themselves. The senior lawyer adjusted his glasses and said, "We can agree to that adjustment, as long as the penalty clause is reduced by 10%. Sarah gave a controlled smile. "Reducing the penalty weakens the contract for our client. But we can find a middle ground. We keep the full penalty, but offer a longer grace period for adjustments, as long as they are communicated in advance." The supplier's lawyers reviewed the proposal, and after a few moments, they nodded. "That seems fair." Mr. Callahan smiled. "I like this approach. Let's move forward with it." Heitor's expression darkened. Sarah looked at him and gave a small wink. "Anything else you'd like to add, Heitor?" He let out a frustrated sigh. "Nothing." Nicholas smiled. "Then we have a deal." As the meeting ended, Heitor left the room without saying a word. Nicholas turned to Sarah and crossed his arms. "I told you I'd like having you here." Sarah smiled. "And I told you I was going to shine." Nicholas laughed. "This war between you two is just beginning." Sarah gathered her papers and walked out of the room, certain that she was bothering the right people. And that only motivated her even more. She knew the battle was far from over. But if Heitor and the others wanted to play a game, then a game they would have. And she was more than ready to win. Sarah left the meeting feeling like she had just won another battle. The furious look on Heitor's face was proof that he had tried to bring her down, and failed miserably. But if life had taught her anything, it was that people like him never gave up after the first attempt. He would come back with something more elaborate, and she needed to be ready. As soon as she returned to her desk, Lena approached with a worried expression. Sarah, I heard a rumor, and I think you should know about it. Sarah crossed her arms. The kind that says, the new girl doesn't belong here, or the kind that says, let's try to ruin her? Lena sighed. The second one. It looks like Hightor and a few other lawyers are setting up a plan to put you in a tough spot. They're talking about a new contract and trying to sneak in a mistake so you'll sign it without noticing. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Do they really think I'm that careless? They're counting on your confidence. Hightor wants you to feel secure enough not to double-check a tiny detail, and by the time you realize it, it'll be too late. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. So they want me to fall because of my own arrogance? Lena nodded. Basically. Sarah gave a calculated smile. Perfect, because I already know exactly how to fight back. Lena blinked, surprised. You already have a plan? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. If they think they're going to catch me off guard, they're going to regret it. Lena gave a half smile. I like your fighting spirit, and I like watching fools fall into their own traps. Sarah spent the rest of the morning working, but she already knew she had to stay one step ahead. If Hightor wanted her to sign a document with an error, the best move was to play along. She would wait for the right moment to turn the tables. Later that afternoon, Nicholas called her into his office. You know Hightor and his group are up to something, right? Sarah dropped into the chair and crossed her legs. Know about it? I'm already waiting for their move. Nicholas smirked. And what's your plan? Let them dangle the bait, and when they think they've caught me, I'll make sure they hang themselves with their own rope. Nicholas chuckled. Should I start worrying about you? Sarah shrugged. Only if you're on the wrong side of the story. He was silent for a moment, then nodded. Then do what you need to do. But make sure that when the dust settles, Hightor has no choice but to accept that you're here to stay. Sarah stood up and gave a small smirk. I always do. The next morning, the office felt strangely quiet. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Sarah noticed it the moment she walked in, but pretended not to. She grabbed a coffee and went to her desk as if it were just another ordinary day. Then Lena appeared with an envelope in her hands. Hightor just sent this to you. Sarah took the envelope without hurry, opened it, and pulled out the papers. She scanned through them quickly, and by the second paragraph, she had already spotted the trap. They had manipulated a clause in the contract so that, if signed as it was, the client would unknowingly waive their right to financial compensation. The problem was that the change was subtle, almost imperceptible to someone who wasn't paying close attention. They wanted her to sign without noticing, and when the mistake was exposed, she would be held responsible. Sarah let out a deep sigh. They could at least be more creative. Lena widened her eyes. You spotted the mistake that fast? Easily. But I'm going to pretend I didn't. Let's see how far they take this. Lena grinned. So the game has officially started? It has. Sarah grabbed a pen, pretended to review the contract, and then scribbled a comment next to the altered clause. Obvious mistake. Clause 5.4 contradicts Article 12.2. Please review before sending for final signature. She folded the paper and handed it back to Lena. Give this back to Hightor. Lena laughed. I'd love to see his face when he reads this. If you have a hidden camera, let me know. Lena left to deliver the document, and Sarah got back to work. Less than 20 minutes later, Hightor appeared beside her desk. Can we talk? Sarah looked up at him with a falsely innocent smile. Something wrong, Hightor? He pressed his lips together. You made a note on the contract. I think you misunderstood something. Sarah blinked. Misunderstood? What do you mean? Hightor took a deep breath, trying to keep his patience. The clause you pointed out isn't wrong. Sarah picked up the papers again, pretending to be confused. Oh wow, you're right. I read it too quickly. But you know what's funny? I almost signed without noticing. Someone distracted could have easily missed it. Imagine that. Hightor crossed his arms. Do you think I'm trying to trick you? Sarah smiled. Me? Of course not. But look, I think this clause could be reworded to avoid any misunderstandings. What do you think? He was silent for a moment. Then he picked up the papers and walked away without saying a word. Lena showed up right after, trying not to laugh. Hyder walked out of here looking like he swallowed a lemon. Sarah smiled. He'll think twice before trying something like that again. Lena sighed. You're handling this better than I expected, and honestly, I'm really enjoying watching it. Sarah picked up a new contract and started reviewing it. Stick around, because I'm sure there will be plenty more to watch. And she was right. Hyder might have failed this time, but he would definitely try again. The only difference was that now he knew Sarah wasn't someone easy to beat. She was a worthy opponent, and if he wanted to play, she would play. And she would win. Sarah knew Hyder wouldn't give up so easily. After the embarrassment in the meeting and his failed attempt to get her to sign a flawed contract, he would definitely come up with something new. She just didn't know what. The morning at the office was busy. Nicholas was out for an external meeting, which meant she'd have some peace, or so she thought. As she sat down to review a new contract, Lena appeared beside her with a worried look. You won't believe what I just heard. Sarah sighed and set her pen down on the table. Let me guess, Hyder? Yes, he's telling everyone you made a mistake in Mr. Callahan's case. Sarah narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Lena pulled up a chair and leaned in to whisper. He's spreading the word that your contract clause left the client vulnerable to a legal dispute. He says that if the rival company wants to, they can use it against Mr. Callahan and demand a renegotiation. Sarah chuckled. Interesting, because if he had found an actual issue, he would have gone straight to Nicholas instead of spreading rumors. Lena smiled. I know, but that doesn't mean he won't try something more serious. He wants to force you to defend yourself in front of everyone. Sarah crossed her arms. Great. Then he's in for another surprise. A few minutes later, an email was sent to all the lawyers in the office. Callahan contract review. Emergency meeting at 3 p.m. Attendance required for Sarah Evans. Lena's eyes widened. He wants to put you on the spot in front of everyone. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, calm as ever. Then let's see him try. At 3 p.m., Sarah walked into the conference room. As expected, the room was full. Nicholas had returned from his meeting and was sitting calmly, while Hyder stood by Barnes and other lawyers who seemed eager for the show. Sarah grabbed a notepad and sat down without showing any nerves. Barnes cleared his throat. We're here to discuss a concern raised by Mr. Hyder Reynolds regarding the review of Mr. Callahan's contract. Nicholas remained neutral. And what exactly is the concern? Hyder smiled smugly. The clause proposed by Evans allows for an interpretative loophole that could be used against our client if the other party challenges it. This puts Mr. Callahan at risk. Sarah feigned surprise and picked up a document. Oh wow, that sounds terrible. Now tell me, Hyder, what exactly is this so-called loophole? Hyder grabbed a paper and pointed to a paragraph. Here, the fact that contractual changes need to be formally documented. If the other party refuses to put them in writing but makes informal changes, they could argue they weren't bound to comply. Sarah held back a smile. You're right, they could argue that. Hyder crossed his arms, feeling victorious. So you admit you made a mistake? Sarah gave a calm smile. No, I admit that you didn't read the entire contract. The room went silent. Sarah slid another document across the table. If you had read the section on contract amendments, you would have seen there's a clause requiring all changes to be formally documented to be legally valid. This means the other party can't refuse to register the changes without invalidating the contract itself. Hyder's face froze. Nicholas finally spoke. So the loophole he found doesn't actually exist? Sarah shrugged. Only in his imagination. The room buzzed with murmurs. Barnes grabbed the documents, read through them quickly, and sighed. Well, then there's nothing to discuss. The contract was drafted correctly. Hyder clenched his fists and stood up. That doesn't mean there wasn't carelessness. Sarah smiled. You're right, because you clearly forgot to read the whole document. Nicholas couldn't hold back his laughter. Barnes slammed the folder onto the table. Meeting adjourned. Hyder stormed out, while Sarah calmly gathered her papers. Nicholas walked over with a smile on his face. You really enjoy making them furious, don't you? Sarah blinked. Me? No way. Nicholas shook his head. If you keep this up, they're going to start having nightmares about you. She laughed. I hope so. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her desk with Lena by her side. He's completely humiliated, Lena whispered. But Sarah, this isn't over. Sarah nodded. I know. He's losing the game, and he's going to try something riskier. Lena glanced around as if expecting Hyder to appear at any moment. Just be careful. Always. A few hours later, Sarah received a new email. This time, it was about a real and urgent case. Evans, I need you to review this contract by tomorrow morning. I trust your work, Nicholas. She opened the attachment and started reading. But as she went through the clauses, her expression grew serious. Something was wrong. She read it again, and again. Her stomach twisted. There was a mistake. But this time, it wasn't one of Hyder's tricks. It was a real mistake. If it went unnoticed, it could cost the client millions. She grabbed a pen and started marking the text. There was work to do, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. Sarah read and reread the contract countless times. The mistake was right there, staring back at her. But it wasn't easy to fix. The clause was ambiguous, and depending on how it was interpreted, it could lead to huge financial losses for the client. She took a deep breath, massaging her temples. This wasn't one of Hyder's traps. It was real. And worse, Nicholas had said he trusted her. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The office was already emptier when Nicholas appeared by her desk, watching her in silence for a few seconds. Still here? Sarah didn't take her eyes off the paper. This is serious, Nicholas. He pulled up a chair and sat next to her, picking up one of the documents. Show me. Sarah slid the contract over and pointed at the problematic clause. Here, depending on how this is interpreted, our client could be forced to pay massive settlements without even being at fault. Nicholas read the clause carefully, his brow furrowing. Damn, this is worse than I thought. She nodded. What if we just remove this part? He shook his head. We can't. The client demanded this clause. They want protection against unexpected contract terminations. If we take it out, they won't accept the deal. Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking. Then we need to rewrite it. But it has to be something that keeps them protected while making sure there are no loopholes for disputes. Nicholas studied her for a moment, a subtle smile on his lips. You take this very seriously. She rolled her eyes. Isn't that the job? He chuckled. Yes, but it's rare to see someone who actually cares about what they do. Most people just want to do the bare minimum so they're not held responsible later. Sarah held back a smile. I'm not most people. He tilted his head slightly, watching her. I know. The way he said it sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She quickly looked away, focusing back on the contract. So, let's fix this before I regret working this late. Nicholas grinned and leaned over the table. Let's do it. 2 hours later, Sarah and Nicholas were still buried in paperwork, surrounded by notes, half-empty coffee cups, and revised versions of the contract. Okay, what if we change this part here? Sarah suggested, scribbling something on the paper. This way, the client keeps their protection against terminations, but we make it clear that the clause can only be triggered under specific conditions. Nicholas read the revision and smiled. That works. Sarah let out a sigh and slumped back in her chair. Finally, Nicholas laughed and leaned back beside her. You did well. She looked at him, exhaustion weighing on her. Thanks. But if you ever have another one of these bombs for me before 2 a.m, let me know in advance, okay? He chuckled. I'll try. For a moment, they sat in silence. The office was almost completely empty. The soft glow of the desk lamps was the only light left, and the quiet was oddly comfortable. That's when Sarah realized how close they were. Nicholas seemed to notice too. His gaze lingered on her, more intense than usual. Sarah cleared her throat and stood up quickly. Well, I guess we can submit this in the morning. Nicholas blinked a few times before smiling. Yes, we can. She grabbed her bag, trying to ignore the strange feeling in the air. All right then, see you tomorrow. Nicholas nodded. See you tomorrow, Evans. Sarah walked out of the office, her heart beating a little faster than it should. That was strange, very strange. But part of her couldn't stop thinking about the way Nicholas had looked at her. And that scared her more than any poorly written contract ever could. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office and found Nicholas already in the meeting room, presenting the new version of the contract to the client. She slipped in quietly and sat beside him. Mr. Carter, the client, was carefully flipping through the pages. "So, you reworked this clause to give me better protection?" Sarah nodded. "Exactly. This way your company won't be vulnerable to misinterpretation and will maintain contractual security." The man studied the document for a few more seconds, then smiled. "This is exactly what I needed." Nicholas crossed his arms, looking satisfied. "So, can we move forward with the signing?" The client picked up the pen and signed without hesitation. Sarah let out a quiet sigh of relief. Another problem solved. When the meeting was over, Nicholas pulled her aside. "You saved this contract, Evans," she smiled. "It was either that or let our client lose millions." He looked at her with an expression that suggested he wanted to say something more. "You really are different from anyone who's ever worked here." She raised an eyebrow. "Different in a good way or a bad way?" He smiled. "Very good." Sarah blinked a few times before looking away. "Well, I'm glad to hear that." Nicholas held her gaze for a moment longer, as if debating whether to say something else, but then he just smiled and left the room. Sarah stood there alone, trying to make sense of what was happening, and why, for the first time since she started working there, she had no argument against what she was feeling. Lately, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the way Nicholas looked at her. It was becoming a problem, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was dangerous. She wasn't there to get distracted or get involved with the boss. She was there to prove her worth, to silence Hightor and every other lawyer who still doubted her. But Nicholas was becoming a distraction that was hard to ignore. That morning, while grabbing coffee in the office kitchen, Lena appeared beside her with a knowing smile. "So you and Nicholas, what's going on?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" Lena laughed. "Oh, come on. I saw the way he looked at you in the meeting yesterday, and I saw how fast you looked away." Sarah huffed, trying to ignore the warmth creeping up her face. "There's nothing going on." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Right. So, it's just my imagination telling me there's chemistry between you two?" Sarah took a sip of her coffee and sighed. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I can't afford to even consider this right now." Lena crossed her arms. "Well, maybe you don't want to think about it, but I think Nicholas already is." Sarah rolled her eyes and walked away before Lena could push her theory any further. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question. What if Lena was right? The day was hectic. Sarah was deep into another major case when Nicholas appeared by her desk. "Can you come to my office?" She looked up at him and nodded. "Of course." When she walked in, Nicholas closed the door behind her and leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I got an anonymous complaint." Sarah frowned. "A complaint? About what?" Nicholas handed her a document. Sarah took the paper and started reading. Her name was on it. Someone had sent a report claiming she wasn't qualified to be at the firm, alleging she was hired improperly and didn't meet company standards. She let out a humorless laugh. "Seriously? This is their latest move?" Nicholas watched her closely. "You know who did this." Sarah took a deep breath. "Hider, it has to be him." Nicholas nodded. "I think so too. But don't worry, this won't go anywhere." Sarah crossed her arms. "Are you sure?" He smiled. "Do you really think I'd let that happen?" She held his gaze for a moment. He was really willing to protect her. "Thank you," she said, letting her guard down just a little. Nicholas stepped a little closer. "You don't have to thank me. I brought you here because I saw your potential. And nothing, no one, is going to change that." Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. He was standing too close. She cleared her throat and looked away. "Well, I should probably get back to work." Nicholas held back a smile. "Yes, but first," she looked at him, suspicious. "First what?" He picked up a file from his desk and handed it to her. "I need you to review this, but I want your honest opinion." Sarah took the papers and raised an eyebrow. "You've already read it?" "Yes, but I want to know what you think." She looked at the document, then back at him. "You really trust my judgment that much?" Nicholas shrugged. "So far, you've been flawless." Sarah gripped the paper a little tighter. "All right, I'll review it and get back to you." Nicholas nodded, but before she walked away, he said, "Evans." She turned around. "Yes?" He smiled. "You take everything so seriously." Just don't forget to breathe once in a while. She let out a small laugh. I'll try. And she left, not realizing she was still holding her breath. That afternoon, Sarah carefully analyzed the document. It was an important contract. But what surprised her was that Nicholas genuinely wanted her opinion. He wasn't just testing her, he wanted her to have a voice. That meant more than she was willing to admit. When she finally finished, she gathered her notes and walked to his office. Nicholas was alone, reading a report. Here it is, she said, handing him the papers. He took them and flipped through the pages, scanning her notes. You found a mistake here? He pointed out. Sarah nodded. Yes, a subtle contradiction in the penalty clause. Nicholas smiled. Well done. She crossed her arms. So did I pass the test? He looked up at her. This wasn't a test. I genuinely wanted your input. Sarah was silent for a moment. Thank you. Nicholas smiled. No, thank you. She realized he was looking at her again, that same way that made her heart beat too fast. Sarah cleared her throat and took a step back. Well, if you need anything else, I'll be at my desk. Nicholas nodded, but as soon as she left, he smiled to himself. Sarah felt like she was stepping into dangerous territory. But for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to step out of it. Sarah was becoming more and more aware of Nicholas's presence. Something between them was shifting, even if neither of them had the courage to admit it. But the office wasn't a place for distractions, and Nicholas was too big of a distraction. That morning, she tried to focus on her work, tried to ignore his gaze whenever he walked past her desk, tried to ignore the tension that built up every time they were alone. But ignoring it was hard when Nicholas made sure to be around. Evans, his voice came from beside her. Sarah closed her eyes for a second before turning to him. What is it? He was holding a folder and a coffee, as if he knew she hadn't had a decent one yet. I need your help with a case. She took the coffee without hesitation. Is this a bribe? Nicholas smiled. Let's call it an incentive. Sarah scoffed but grabbed the folder and started flipping through the documents. What's the case? Nicholas pulled up a chair and sat next to her. The client wants to terminate a contract without paying a penalty, but the supplier is claiming breach of contract. We need to find a middle ground so that no one gets hurt. Sarah skimmed through the document quickly. This isn't that complicated. There's a loophole here. If they argue the supplier delayed delivery, they can justify termination without a penalty. Nicholas smiled. You have an incredible talent for this. Sarah rolled her eyes. Don't praise me just yet. We need to see if this actually holds up in court. Nicholas watched her for a moment, as if evaluating something beyond the case. You're one of the most determined people I've ever met. Sarah looked away. And you're annoyingly observant. He laughed. I'm a lawyer. It's part of the job. She sighed and grabbed a pen. All right, let's get this done. But even as they worked, Sarah could feel the tension in the air, and she knew it was getting harder and harder to ignore. That night, Sarah stayed late at the office. So did Nicholas. You should go home, he said, leaning against her office door. Sarah let out a sigh. So should you. He gave a small smirk. But I'm the boss, she laughed. Does that mean you get to ignore common sense? He stepped inside and sat across from her. It means I can work late without anyone questioning me. Sarah crossed her arms. Except me. Nicholas studied her for a moment before saying, except you. The silence that followed was too intense. She glanced down at the papers on her desk. I really need to finish this. Sarah, she froze. He rarely called her by her first name. Nicholas seemed to be struggling with his words. Before he could continue, his phone rang. He picked it up, and his expression changed. I have to take this. Sarah nodded quickly, relieved by the interruption. But part of her knew that sooner or later, that conversation would happen, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The next day, the office was buzzing with activity. Lena rushed to Sarah's desk, looking frantic. You won't believe this. Sarah looked at her, exhausted. What now? Nicholas has a business dinner tonight with an important client. And guess who he invited to join him? Sarah blinked. Who? Lena smiled. You. Sarah felt her stomach twist. What? He said he wants you there. Said your presence is essential for the negotiation. Sarah took a deep breath. This isn't a date. It's just work. Lena laughed. Sure. Sarah ignored her and went back to work, but now her heart was beating way too fast, and she didn't know if it was because of the dinner or because, for the first time, she couldn't see Nicholas as just her boss. Let's play a little game for those who only read the comments. Type Coca-Cola in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now let's get back to the story. Sarah spent the entire day trying to ignore the fact that she would be having dinner with Nicholas that night. She kept telling herself it was just work, but the way Lena looked at her, with that mischievous smile, made it clear not everyone saw it that way. When the time finally came, Sarah went home to get ready. She chose a simple but elegant black dress and styled her hair in a neat way. She didn't want to look like she was trying too hard, but she also didn't want to be unprepared. When she arrived at the restaurant, Nicholas was already there. He wore a perfectly tailored suit as always, but he looked more relaxed than he did in the office. "Evans," he said when he saw her walk in. She crossed her arms. "Smith," he smiled, clearly amused. "You can't relax for even a second, can you?" Sarah sighed and sat down at the table. "Not when I'm working with you." Nicholas chuckled and leaned in slightly. "That means I'm doing a good job." Before Sarah could respond, the client arrived. Mr. Harrington was an important businessman and was negotiating a major contract with the firm. The dinner started formally, with discussions about business and contracts. Sarah presented her arguments with confidence, making it clear she had studied every detail. Mr. Harrington seemed impressed. "You're very sharp, Miss Evans." Sarah smiled. "Thank you. I try my best." Nicholas looked at her with pride in his eyes. The dinner went smoothly, but at one point when the client went to the restroom, Sarah noticed Nicholas watching her in a different way. "What?" she asked. He hesitated for a second before answering. "You surprise me more every day." Sarah looked away. "I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing." Nicholas gave a small smile. "Definitely a good thing." She took a deep breath, feeling like this conversation was heading into dangerous territory. "Don't mix things up, Nicholas." He raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly am I mixing up?" Sarah narrowed her eyes. "You know." Nicholas was silent for a moment before sighing. "You always have an answer for everything, don't you?" She smirked. "It's my job." The dinner ended, and the contract was practically sealed. Mr. Harrington left satisfied, leaving Sarah and Nicholas alone at the table. "Do you want me to drive you home?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "No need. I can go on my own," he smiled. "I know you can, but that doesn't mean I can't offer." She looked at him for a moment before finally sighing. "All right." On the way home, the silence in the car was heavy, until Nicholas finally spoke. "You feel it, don't you?" Sarah knew exactly what he was talking about, but she pretended not to understand. "Feel what?" He glanced at her before turning his eyes back to the road. "Whatever this is between us." She took a deep breath. "Nicholas, don't tell me I'm imagining things." Sarah stayed silent, because he wasn't. After a while he just sighed. "Got it." She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. When they reached her place, Sarah got out of the car without saying anything. But before going inside, she looked at Nicholas one last time. He was still sitting there, watching her with something unreadable in his eyes. And Sarah knew that, no matter how much she tried to avoid it, something between them had already changed forever. And the next day, nothing would be the same. Sarah woke up the next morning with a weight on her chest. The night before was still fresh in her mind, and no matter how much she tried to push the thoughts away, her conversation with Nicholas kept replaying. "You feel it, don't you?" Yes, she did. But admitting it was a point of no return. She didn't want to mix work with feelings. She couldn't. Ever since she started at that firm, she had to prove herself every single day, facing people like Hector and showing everyone that her position there wasn't a mistake. If Nicholas was involved, everything would get even more complicated. When she arrived at the office, she tried to act normal. But Nicholas was there too, and when their eyes met, it was clear he hadn't forgotten their conversation. He walked over, speaking quietly. "Can we talk?" Sarah hesitated. "I'm busy right now." "Then later," she sighed. "Nicholas," he crossed his arms, "you can keep pretending nothing is happening, but I won't. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. He never spoke like that. He always had a teasing remark, a smile on his face, a sharp comeback. But now he was serious. Before she could answer, Lena rushed in. "Sarah, we have a problem." She silently thanked the interruption. "What is it?" Heiter. Sarah's whole body went on high alert. What did he do now? Lena handed her a document. "He filed a formal complaint against you with the board. He's claiming your hiring was irregular and that you don't have the necessary qualifications for the job." Nicholas grabbed the paper from Lena's hand and skimmed through it. "This is ridiculous." Sarah crossed her arms. "He really wants to take me down," Lena sighed. "The problem is he got a meeting with Barnes to discuss it." Sarah frowned. "When?" "In an hour." She closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. "Then let's settle this once and for all." At the meeting with Barnes, Heitor had a smug smile on his face. "All I'm asking is for Evan's hiring to be reviewed." Barnes looked at Sarah. "What do you have to say about this?" Sarah crossed her arms. "That this is nothing but a personal attack because I proved I'm better than him." Heitor laughed. "Oh, sure. This has nothing to do with your questionable credentials?" Nicholas stepped in. "If the issue is credentials, we can provide Evans's academic records and her performance in the company." Sarah slid a folder across the table. "Here it is." Barnes opened the documents and read. Sarah waited. Heitor waited. Nicholas waited. Until Barnes finally closed the folder and looked at Heitor. "Your complaint is unfounded. Miss Evans was hired on merit and has demonstrated more than enough competence for her position. There's nothing more to discuss." Sarah smiled. Heitor, on the other hand, was furious. "This is absurd." Barnes gave him a cold stare. "What's absurd is you wasting the board's time with a baseless complaint. If you want to stay in this office, I suggest you focus on your own work." Heitor clenched his jaw, but he had no choice but to accept defeat. Nicholas looked at Sarah with a proud smile. "I told you no one was going to take you down." She took a deep breath. "Thank you." Barnes stood up. "This meeting is over." Sarah gathered her documents and walked out with Nicholas by her side. When they reached the hallway, he gently grabbed her arm. "Can we talk now?" Sarah looked at him. "Nicholas," he gave a small smile. "You know, if you want to keep running from this, I can let it go. But I'm going to ask you one last time." She swallowed hard. "Ask what?" He took a step closer, and this time Sarah didn't back away. "Do you feel this as much as I do?" Sarah stayed silent, but at that moment, she saw everything that had happened in that office. Every time Nicholas had supported her, every glance they had exchanged, every time her heart had beaten faster than it should have. She could keep denying it, or she could finally accept it. She took a deep breath and looked at him. "Yes." Nicholas smiled. "Finally." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You're impossible." He laughed, and before she could say anything else, he cupped her face and kissed her. It was as if everything around them disappeared. Sarah had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. Sarah had never believed in fairy tales. She had always been used to fighting for everything on her own, protecting herself before anyone could hurt her. But there, in Nicholas's arms, with his lips on hers, she realized she might have found something she never thought she would. He kissed her with an intensity that made her heart pound, as if all the tension between them was finally breaking free. When they pulled apart, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers, a satisfied smile on his lips. "I've waited a long time for this." Sarah, still catching her breath, looked at him. "And now that you have it?" He held her face gently. "Now, I want more." She smiled, feeling lighter than ever. "Then I guess we're on the same page." Nicholas chuckled and kissed her again, this time with no rush. The office could wait. The world could wait. At that moment, it was just the two of them. In the months that followed, their relationship evolved naturally. Nicholas respected Sarah's pace, never pressuring her, and little by little, she allowed herself to trust him. Of course, the entire office found out about their relationship. Lena nearly exploded with joy when she heard they were finally together. "I knew it. I knew this would happen," she exclaimed. This office was begging for a power couple. Sarah rolled her eyes but laughed. Heitor, on the other hand, was furious. But after the humiliation he had suffered, he realized he no longer had the strength to fight them. Sarah and Nicholas worked together like an unbeatable team, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly happy. But Nicholas had a plan. He wanted more, much more. On a quiet weekend, Nicholas took Sarah out for a special dinner. "Any particular occasion?" she asked suspiciously as they walked into the upscale restaurant. "I just wanted to spoil you a little," he replied with a mysterious smile. Sarah frowned. "You never do anything without a reason." He laughed. "Blame it on my lawyer instincts." During dinner, Nicholas seemed calmer than usual, but Sarah could sense something in the air. Then, when the waiter brought dessert, a small envelope was placed next to her plate. "What's this?" Sarah asked. Nicholas just smiled. With slight hesitation, Sarah opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper inside. It was a legal document, but as she started reading, her heart raced. It was a marriage certificate with their names on it. She looked at Nicholas, stunned. "What?" He stood up, pulled a small box from his pocket, and got down on one knee. The entire restaurant went silent. "Sarah Evans," he began, his eyes shining. "From the day you walked into that elevator and argued with me, I knew you were different. But I didn't know you would completely change my life." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You taught me to see the world in a new way, to truly care. And you made me realize that nothing is worth it if I can't share it with you." He opened the small box, revealing a stunning ring. "So now, in the most cliché yet sincere way possible, will you marry me?" Sarah laughed, wiping her eyes. "You really used a legal document to propose to me?" Nicholas smiled. "I thought it was fitting." She looked at him, the man who challenged her, who believed in her when no one else did, who became her partner both in and out of the office. And then, without hesitation, she answered, "Yes." Nicholas laughed and slid the ring onto her finger before kissing her. As the restaurant erupted in applause. At that moment, Sarah knew that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. A few months later, their wedding day arrived. The ceremony was held in a beautiful garden, with white flowers decorating the space and a perfect blue sky above them. Sarah looked stunning in her white dress, holding a delicate bouquet as she walked down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Nicholas, who waited for her at the altar with a loving smile. Lena, her maid of honor, tried to hold back tears. "I never thought I'd see Sarah getting married," she whispered. Sarah laughed. "Me neither." When she reached the altar, Nicholas gently took her hands. The officiant began the ceremony, but Sarah and Nicholas barely heard a word. They were lost in each other. When it was time for the vows, Nicholas took a deep breath before speaking. "Sarah, I never imagined that an argument in an elevator would lead me to you. But now, looking back, I see that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me want to be a better man. And today, in front of everyone, I promise to keep challenging you, supporting you, and loving you for the rest of my life." Sarah held back tears and smiled before saying her vows. "Nicholas, you are the most infuriating and charming person I have ever met. From the very beginning, you made me question everything, challenged me, and helped me grow. And now I can't imagine my life without you. So today, in front of everyone, I promise I will never argue with you in an elevator again." The guests laughed, and so did Nicholas. "But I also promise that I will always stand by your side, no matter what." The officiant smiled. "Nicholas Smith, do you take Sarah Evans as your wife?" "I do." "Sarah Evans, do you take Nicholas Smith as your husband?" She looked at him, her heart racing. "I do." "Then I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Nicholas didn't wait. He pulled Sarah into a passionate kiss as the guests cheered. And in that moment, Sarah knew. She had found her place, her home, her love. What did you think of Sarah and Nicholas's story? Share your opinion in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to keep up with all our stories. And don't forget to check out more heartfelt stories by clicking here on the end screen.